Hey everybody, thank you for joining the very first session of our very first virtual CS2. For those of you that joined us in the previous CS2 events in Indianapolis and in Huntsville, thank you for coming back and joining us. We are going to get started with Ben Curry from Summit 7. This is going to be, of the two sessions, probably one of the more, I shouldn't say technical, but it'll definitely be focused specifically on the CM domain, configuration management. We want to continue to, as we do more of these CS2 virtual events, to deep dive into some of the domains as we go along. And so the first one up is going to be configuration management. So I'm going to do a quick intro to Ben, and then I'm going to hand it over to him and let him do his thing. So Ben Curry of Summit 7 is a CISSP, author, and enterprise architect specializing in Microsoft Cloud technologies. That's why we have him here today for government suppliers. Ben is a managing partner at Summit 7 and honored to have received 11 Microsoft MVP awards due to his investments in both the SharePoint and Office 365 community as the platform has advanced, along with championing transformational projects for several nonprofits and Fortune 500 companies as well. He's a former NASA data center lead and architect and has published several pieces of work through the Microsoft Press. And most recently, he published From IT Pro to Cloud Pro, Microsoft Office 365 and SharePoint Online. So go check that out. So Ben, let's start talking about CMMC. Let's start talking about the CM domain, otherwise known as configuration management, which, as I understand, is a carryover from NIST 800-171, correct?
Yeah, I mean, there was a good bit of configuration management, but I think, as we read CMMC, especially as we get into the description and the examples, they're expecting a lot more than just, having a spreadsheet or saying, we're compliant. And they're going to want to see proof,
right.
And they're going to want to see details.
Right.
So to that end, let's go ahead and let's dive into the configuration management practice areas in CMMC. L3. Now you'll notice if you look, there are no configuration management requirements for L1. So there's no level 1 practices. It's all level 2, 3, and beyond. But today we'll focus on 2 and 3. And we'll talk about we'll dive into those, break those apart. And I'm going to take some guesses as to what I think the assessors are looking for. But before we begin, I want you to know all the discussion notes here today were pulled from the CMMC model appendices. There's a link on your screen. I've tried to keep my opinion out of this. I'm an enterprise architect by trade. I have lots of opinions. But I'm trying to keep this in the discussion examples that they have given us inside of their documentation and in some of the Q&As. If you'll hold your questions till the end, we will do a Q&A at the end of the presentation. So just hold those. We'll do those all at one time. So let's go ahead and take a look at the first one. Now note that I'm not going to cover every CM practice here. There's a ton of overlap. The first couple, I'm going to do a deep dive, and then I'm going to only talk about the nuances of each control thereafter. Okay, so you'll see what I'm talking about. It'd be really boring because you'd hear me say the same thing 4 times. So let's go ahead and dig into the first one. That's CM2064. I'll read it for you. Establish and enforce security configuration settings for information technology products employed in organizational systems. Mm-hmm. So this is a big practice. At a glance, people look at this and say, hey, that's not too bad. But this is one of the more comprehensive practices, I think, in all of CMMC Level 3, because this touches every device in your organization. Let's break it down a little bit here. What I've done is try to get you to think 2 different ways. It's easy to overlook the verbs in this, but I think they're very important when we go to CMMC, and at least what we think you'll be assessed on as well. So first, establish. When we talk about establishing a configuration, we're really talking about a comprehensive design. So to establish configuration management means you have at the basics a Word document or spreadsheet on every single connected device and any non-connected device that hosts CUI. Okay? Think about your thermostats, your conference room cameras, your voice switches, your physical security systems, your HVAC controllers. all of these things that are connected to your Wi-Fi and your network. And if you really think about IoT, I think that's where some people are overlooking items: printers, scanners, telephones, VoIP devices. So remember, we have to have a configuration baseline for every single one of these items. This is beyond, I think, what we really had to do in NIST. This is they're looking for real configuration management control. The second piece of this is enforce. So if you notice the control, it says establish and enforce. Enforcement, and that's very intentional, right? They don't want us to just say, here's our configuration, and now whoever changes it's fine. They want you to lock it down, right? So they're expecting us to create a configuration baseline and put governance and rules in place to ensure only approved people are updating that configuration baseline. So, ton of sense. They dive in a little bit in the discussion. You can go read this for yourself in the appendices, but they start specifying what they want to see in change management. I pulled this out. The key was security parameters that can be changed in hardware, software, and firmware that can affect the security posture and functionality. So I think that's where we look at. This is what they're looking for, and they broke it out into two sections. Really, the first is parameters that directly impact the security state. We know what those are. That's username, that's password, that's DNS, that's broadcast channels, that's username, multi-factor. Those directly impact the security state of the device. However, when CMMC, when you break this down and look at the examples and description, they include application level parameters and not just security. So this is when we talk about you have to have a complete baseline. This is a big deal. Think about registry, file share permissions, roles, permission groups. But this is even who can control the temperature, right? They want you to understand everybody who can touch stuff, and they want to know every configuration setting on every device, not just the security parameters, but they want all application level. That's a lot of work. We've spent a ton of time at Summit 7 to get compliant with this. We've even had to go so far as gut all of our wireless and put in new compliant wireless systems that could meet all of these controls. So be prepared. You may actually have to replace some devices. If you've got a thermostat that, on internet connected or IoT, and you don't have the ability to track the baseline and control who can access it, you probably have to replace it.
Ben?
Yes, John.
I was gonna ask you, does this even include encryption settings, like how machines and applications are configured for encryption?
It does. It includes every setting on the machine. Okay. Now, of course, you take a Windows 10 machine. We're not going to document every possible registry setting, but I think if you at least were to say the STIGs, this is what we do. We pull the STIGs out for Win 10, and we use that as a baseline, and we hit at least those settings.
Okay, gotcha. No, that makes sense. It's some of the questions rolling in. That's kind of there was one that called out encryption specifically as something that could be included in some of these baselines in your documentation.
Yeah, and then encryption would actually be included in the security parameter, the first one, because those directly impact the security state. Now that you bring it up, Sean, there are two here, two bullets here. I think the assessors are really going to key in on that first one. Parameters that directly impact the security state. They are going to be looking for the others. They've all but told us so in the appendices. We can read it. But yeah, especially things like encryption, usernames, password, open TCP ports, that kind of thing.
Gotcha.
So what does this mean real world? Real world, well, first of all, you're going to have a baseline for everything you have. And if you're like a lot of small to medium businesses, you don't have this. We have some system designs, but if you said this Wi-Fi router has 89 settings, do I know what all those 89 settings are? I have a thermostat that has 60 settings. I have a cell phone that has 240 settings. Like, do we actually know every one of our devices, all the configuration items, and do we have that documented? I think that's going to be one of the first big challenges is getting everything we had inventoried. Remember, back in asset management, you'll see if you go back and read the appendices, asset management is a requirement. we must know every device, software version numbers. So if you don't have either one of those done, yeah, we've got a lot of work cut out for us. Create an inventory and then a baseline on all of our inventory for the configuration of that device, document it, and then enforce on top of it, okay? Just remember things like, I put some commonly forgot areas. If you have cloud providers you're working with, you need to have configuration on that environment. A prime example is Office 365. You need to have every single setting in 365 documented and intentionally configured, and especially the security parameters.
Hey, Ben, go ahead. I was going to ask you on the Microsoft side of things, and you mentioned Office 365 or Microsoft 365, taking it in a slightly different direction too with Azure. Does Microsoft provide capabilities to basically streamline some of these baselining type activities? So I think Azure policies or Azure blueprints, some of these terms I've heard before and some folks are asking about in the chat. Can you talk a little bit about that and how that kind of makes this a little bit easier possibly, or maybe not?
Yeah, it does. Luckily 365 is largely something you do one time. You get it configured, you make it CMMC compliant, and you build a multi-tab spreadsheet or a database to host those settings. Then you just track changes and enforce. Azure is a huge animal, right? The other day I looked, there were 389 services offered by Azure or Azure, depends on where you live. And so, absolutely. So we have, Microsoft has an 800, 171 blueprint. Understand though, it's very focused on a web application, a SQL server, a couple servers. There's no way they can give us a blueprint for every possible IaaS configuration known to man. The way we attack that, we do like the blueprints a lot. What blueprints allow us to do is we get a baseline configured, and then only certain people can even change parts of that baseline. Think like network security groups, subnets, firewall settings, those types of things in Azure are controlled by the blueprint and nobody can change those. Also, if they create new services, they're bound by the constraints in our blueprint. That's different than just scripting. We do a lot of scripting on services. For one, it pulls the human error out. Two, it allows us to do lessons learned. But three, it gives us this configuration baseline, right? So you're sitting with an assessor and they said, how are you managing, Azure XYZ? And we give them a JSON file and say, here's how we do it every time. And here's the processes we secure that script. They're going to go, hey, I really like that. And that's our approach to that. So script as much as possible. I think that gets to your what you were asking about. Limit access to everything, right? So don't miss any Azure service, any Azure app. No, Windows devices, printer scanners. You got to have passwords on everything. You can't have your printers and scanners wide open. So all devices. Now this is really important, right? So the awesome part of this is that we could create scripts to help control this baseline. However, the assessors are absolutely, they've specified this in the dependencies. They're going to be looking, how are we securing those scripts? Because if I'm a outsider, and I'm a bad actor, let's say, if I can change those scripts, I just have to wait for you to run them, and then I would have access to your network. So we really want to lock down the things, the PowerShell scripts, the JSON files, GPO templates, those types of things. Because of time, let's go to the next one, CM2065. That is track, review, approve, disapprove, and log changes to organizational systems. If you've read these, you're going to notice that in at least three of these, they use essentially this list, but they use different words each time, and some have some are more inclusive or less inclusive of the actions they expect. I can't answer why. But I'm going to walk you through that, and at the end, I'll give you a combined list of I think, what they're looking for. CM2065 is all about how we track changes. So proposed changes, how do we capture that? Somebody wants a change on a system. We're going to usually see two primary types of changes. One is a system level change. It's a security patch. It's a configuration change to support some other activity. Or if the business is asking for solutions of functionality, and they're wanting to know, can they implement that change? Those are the big two, right, we see come in. And so you need some type of basic process. Now, this does not say you have to have a a mature change control process. However, to meet L3, these other practice areas requirements, you're going to have at least a small or a simple change management process. These are, generally done through like change control boards or a governance working group, if you will, governance boards, those types of things is how we get approval, and we can then approve who can access. That board also becomes the enforcement. Remember, in the beginning, it said you must enforce as well. So they offer that enforcement. So let's take a look at that. When you get into the discussion on this, remember they had like propose, justify, testing. Then they add some. And so what I've done is I've added those into a new list. This is our second list. Propose. So what do we want to do? What change do we want? Justify it. Be able to track that throughout its life cycle, even if it was disapproved. How do we test it? And that's a key here. They pointed out testing changes. So it's not enough to approve the change and put it in place. They called out testing changes as well. Review, and then the very important one is documentation, right? So what do we do with it, and how do we document that? I've done a lot of work over the years of building control boards, helping define processes around this. I'm going to try to help those of you who say, you know what, I get it. Our change control board is me. I mean, in the early days at Summit 7, I was the control board, right? We matured past that now. But now you're seeing you need some approval group, or at least 2 people. So let me give you some tips. If you've never done it, most people try to create this governance board, and it sounds like a great idea, and all changes go through this governance board. The problem is that board ended up meeting every few weeks, and we need changes within days or weeks. And so you still have to have that board. I still think they should review changes, but I'm going to give you an example here of having what I call subcommittees. So for time's sake, keep it simple. You have a group of developers. If a change request comes in, the developer team looks at it and says, this does not need to go in front of the governance board. We can approve it and we'll notify the board of the change. Same with IT pro or administrator patches. And if it's routine stuff that doesn't affect the entire platform, that group can approve it with a manager involved, and only the governance board is notified. I found this kind of two-tiered approach to work really well, so your change management remains agile, yet the important things are caught by the governance board, and you're documenting everything. Let's move forward a little faster on the last couple here. The next one is CM2066. It is analyze the security impact of changes prior to implementation. I mean, they've already told us to review, they've told us to test, and in this one, they've specifically called out security impact of changes. Remember in the beginning where they called out security parameters and then all the other application settings, but kind of in 2 groups? I'm back to this. I kind of tie this to that first one. This is my opinion, by the way. This is not fact. But when I see this, analyze security impact of changes, I'm thinking about those security parameters that they asked us to do several slides back. And I hone in. It's not the only thing in this control, so don't say, hey, that's all. But that would be my focus area. And I've listed some bullets here. This is my opinion on these bullets, but defining roles, who has responsibilities, how do you document, roles, who's doing device analysis, who's doing pen testing, and this certainly needs to be anything security with security impact. You might want to push that not in the subcommittees, but maybe at that top board. The next one is CM3067, and this again comes into defining, documenting, enforcing physical and logical access restrictions. There's a lot of overlap here, so I'm only going to call out the differences. This one does call out physical access control. So if you've got a server that's got battery backup and that's you've got Wi-Fi, controlling physical access to, say, your Wi-Fi routers, controlling physical access to servers. This control is saying, hey, you can't just have it in a closet where everybody can see it. This needs to be locked down. Logical access control, same thing, but think cloud. oh, I've got servers in Amazon Gov, I've got servers in Azure Gov. Hopefully you have no servers in commercial because there's a lot of compliance issues with that. But let's assume you're in Azure Gov. We still need to go out there and control logical access to that, just like we would an office or a server room on premises. They talk about automation. And I think this is where, if we define at least a basic change control process, I think that's an opportunity for a workflow. And doing that workflow, we'd also help meet this CM3067 to talk about how we automate that change control process. It's interesting on this one. This last bullet point, they called out limit changes from only allowed IP addresses, trusted devices, and predefined update sources. So there's something they called out in the example though. So it's not mandatory. I think what we don't know yet is when the assessors start doing these, are they gonna try to enforce everything in the examples or the discussion? But I think that gives us a really good place to start. So read it for yourself, make your own decision, but those are listed in the CMMC appendices document, that PDF file. So let me give you a combined, so we've seen you should do things in 3 different practice areas. So I'm going to combine this, and so this is the list. If you go across the CM practices, this is what you must do, right? Propose and define. So one control says propose, the other one says define and justify. I think that's the same thing by and large. Mm-hmm. And so I just kind of put those together. Look, what do you want to do? How are you going to do it? And then justify it. We've seen that justification was spelled out. Track it, makes total sense. Review it. That's your control boards. Enforce it. That's your governance board, ensuring only the right people have access to change these, and your approve, disapprove, test, and disposition. So this is kind of the list that I used when I say, hey, how are we changing? Are we CMMC compliant? Are we managing these changes? This is a list I go to and look at. This is my little combined list. A couple of these I did call out here. We're not doing all of the CM practices, but let me talk about this first one. First, it says restrict, disable, or prevent the use of non-essential programs, function ports, protocols, and services. It's interesting they call this out here again. It talks about it in other practice areas, but they really want us to shut down everything on devices we don't use. If you've got, solitaire, they want everything stripped off these devices to reduce that surface area for attack and vulnerability. It's mandatory to run Windows Firewall or something similar. You have to limit the protocols, ports, and programs that machine can use when it's on the network and internet both. So the idea that we were going to use just perimeter firewalls, those days are gone. I don't think that'll pass muster. And this last one here, I really want to call out. This is a really big deal. I should have given its own slide, but it's a really big deal. Application whitelisting is now a mandatory requirement. When you get into the description, it says that we can blacklist or whitelist, and that's fine. But it does say an application vetting process. So this is what they really want. In L3, they don't push this hard. In L4 and 5, you have to whitelist, right? So you have to define every program you allow on your devices. Total pain. At least here in L3, we could go pay for a blacklisting service, use the client, and control what's on our devices through that service, okay? So you can do your own whitelisting. If you've never done it, it's not simple. I hate to tell you, it's not simple. Because you have to load the device on a Windows machine, you have to get the signatures off of it, and the problem is every major version change of that application, you have to do it again. So it's a real pain to do whitelisting. It is the most secure way. That is how we keep rogue apps off of our devices. So that's it today. We will take some Q&A from you guys, and thanks.
Yeah.
Thanks again for being here, and thanks for listening to me ramble on about configuration management.
Yeah, Ben, I appreciate it. I think you've done an excellent job of covering pretty much most of it as it pertains to levels 2 and 3, which I'll roll up into level 3 and getting a level 3 audit and passing one. So I have three. We have time enough, at least for three, that are kind of consistent that could tease out some of these as well. So I know it doesn't call this out in CMMC. I know they give an example, and for instance, they say a month for one of these things, but for a CCB or an advisory board or change control board, et cetera, how often do you think they should meet, and who should be involved? Ideally, let's say a 150 person company and they have resources and everybody has a little bit of free time. What does that look like?
Yeah, that's a good question. Generally, we start with this group. We start with a senior executive. So executive vice president, president, smaller company, maybe even the CEO is at least on the board. They don't have to attend every meeting, but they are on the board and they are aware. And then a project management should be involved on the board as well. And that's to ensure, scheduling, resourcing, and any type of risk they need to roll up to executive management. HR is often overlooked. It's something that Summit 7, we highly recommend to get HR involved in this because you don't know how this impacts users and privacy laws and all kinds of things. So when you make changes, does HR like it? That's a good place to start as well. And some obvious areas, IT director, and then the two key ones, there's three key ones. You need a lead from all of your administrators, at least one person. Maybe it's your senior, your lead admin. Then second, your senior or lead developer. And then third, an end user representative. And this is hugely helpful. People often overlook this. So have all your end users elect one person where they give all their changes and requests to, and that person shows up to the board and gives that end user a perspective. Generally boards meet every 4 to 6 weeks. That's why I think we need some of those subcommittees to make some small decisions in between those meetings.
That's great. Some other things that you talked about, and this question ties into it, is you have all these details, these baseline configurations for these various things, and you want to document those, whether it be a spreadsheet or maybe even a Word file. I don't necessarily know, but it kind of evokes a system security plan and that requirement to have some of those documents. Are some of these things going to roll into that SSP? Is it SSP and some of these baselines? How does that work? How do those play?
Yeah, I mean the SSP doesn't replace the need for this, but the SSP requires this as well. So you can't fully flesh out your SSP unless you have configuration baselines. They specifically call out having essentially a full baseline, a design for all your devices and network.
Okay. And then lastly, how would an MSP or an MSSP play into some of these activities? Would they be involved in the advisory board, control board? Would they be the ones proposing where there's gaps? How does an MSP and or an MSSP integrate into configuration management and running that entirely?
Yeah, and I'm glad you separated those. I think practices that try to do both within the same practice, they're fooling themselves. They're two different things. It's two different thought processes. It's two different types of employees. I mean, all the way down. We know security people. I am one, so I can talk about us, right? So we are way more paranoid than most people, than a server administrator on an MSP would be. So it is kind of two different areas. Managed services provider. If first of all you need to be with a CMMC level 3 or higher service provider, because they're accessing your system. So when you look at all these controls, if they're accessing your system, you need to know that they're up to date. You need to know they're MFA'd locally, and the only way we can do that is to have them CMMC L3 or 100% of the work is done on our equipment. Most people don't want to do that, right? That means you'd have to issue a laptop and network and servers that MSP could never put anything on their systems. That is highly unlikely. We also haven't heard yet if an MSP or MSSP is required to meet the level, but I think they will, right? So I think that's